Right, welcome to part 4 of the scrap challenge, making the home dumbbell. And we now have to get on to actually building. The first part that we're going to build is the actual wheel. And to do that, we're going to cut out various circles of chipboard that we'll then sandwich together to make the wheel as per the design. But I had a look at the amount of thin hardboard that I have, and having measured the wheel around, unfortunately I'm not in a position to use that to create the shrouding around the edge of the wheel. And consequently what I've decided to do is to actually make the outside two parts of the wheel out of this large sheet of fluorine grade 18mm chipboard, and these are going to be actually the shrouds as well. So they'll be slightly larger diameter than the inner ones, but I can actually fit two off this 8x4 sheet. So including the shroud, the diameter we're looking for is 105 centimeters. Yes, I've actually decided I better go metric on this, and so what I need to do is to mark out two 105 diameter circles on here. I can then cut them out with the jigsaw. So I know then that I have a radius of 52.5. So what I've done is I've got a piece of scrap timber. I put a screw in one end, measured from there to 52.5, and I can now take a pencil, put that in there. If I fix that at the centre point, I then have a large set of compasses to draw it out. So the first thing I need to do is to find the centre of this half of the board, because that's where we're going. So I've marked that here. So if I simply screw this to create the pivot, and I can now put in a pencil into the 52.5 point, and we just get a circle. Now the second part is to create the quadrants, and of course the outside those want to be on the radius. We're going to set the radius to the edge of those quadrants to about 40 centimeters. So I've drilled another hole in here at 40, and I can now mark the central point for the two quadrants on the wheel. So that is one. We now have to mark out the other one the same, and then we can cut those out. So I'll get on and do that now. Okay, so we've got the two quadrants, the two circles marked out, and we've got the inside circle for the quadrant itself. So now what I'm going to do is to cut this in half and basically cut these out with a jigsaw. So there we have The first of the two parts of the wheel, the two outsides. So the next part is to pick my next piece of timber and make another 2 or 3 of these circles for the inside. Right, the next piece I found, which I'm going to use, is actually the centre of an old partition in an office. Again, it's chipboard. It's only about 12 mil, but I think it will. It's certainly big enough to do another central circle, the first of those. So at first I need to strip off the old padding and the fabric covering, and then I can mark that out as an inner wheel at 95 centimeters, and then I'll cut that one out. So let's get on with that. So there we have the first part of the inner wheel, which I now need to make another few of these. Now this next bit is going to be quite interesting because I haven't got any more pieces which will actually fit that 95 degrees. So consequently, I think what I'm going to have to do is to put some pieces together to actually make it up, hold it solid, and then cut it round. And then when it sits inside the wheel, because we're going to screw through and actually bolt the wheel together to ensure it's flat, I think that'll work absolutely fine. But obviously a bit more work to do yet. Right, we got the next two cut out. In this case, what I've had to do is to actually use 2 pieces. So I've ended up with a circle, and then there's a piece which I'm going to have to attach. But as we're actually connecting the pieces with the shroud to the end, as long as we actually screw through or bolt through, then we can keep that piece in place without any difficulty at all. So putting these all together, that's given us nearly enough, not quite. So I need to do one more circle of chipboard, which I'll need to make out of multiple other pieces again. Currently we're at 3.5. We're at about 5.3 centimeters. 53 centimeters. So now what we're going to have to do is I'll find another piece that's a 12 mil bit or multiple bits. We'll put those together. They can go in the middle, and then we'll have all the parts to our wheel complete. So I'll get on with that now. So this last part of the wheel, it's actually going to be made in 3 pieces, and it's going to have a gap in between because I just haven't got the timber to do it in one piece. So I've actually done it in 3. So now when we measure, we should have the inside wheel is going to be 63 millimeters, which is just about perfect. So I'm going to clear up now, and then we'll see about sitting the wheels on top and actually show exactly how it's going to be fixed together. And then we're going to have to cut out the quadrants on the outside two pieces, and then use those to mark the inners, which as well we'll have to secure together so that they don't move around. One comment I would have is this wheel is pretty heavy. I will weigh it actually before it goes up, but I think we've got because of the diameter, we've gone for a fairly large wheel. Its weight is actually heavier than I would have expected, but it's a good job I've got some decent beams up in the loft. I don't think it's going to be any problem structurally. So let's get tidied up and we'll see about assembling the wheel. Right, so now we've got the timber cut out for the wheel, we can look at how we're going to actually put it together. So I've got one of the outside parts here. This is, we call this the bottom of the wheel. We then have the other parts that we can fit together somewhat like a jigsaw puzzle. Now you can see on the edge of this one there is because we didn't quite have enough room in the sheet, there is a fillet that I need to make for that. But that's not going to be too serious. So that, to all intents and purposes, is the wheel with the final piece on the top. So we've got a bit more work to do on this, but you now can see the principle. What we're going to do is to mark out the quadrants. They are actually on the other side of this one. So we can mark out the quadrants with the piece that we drew on before, so that we can cut those out. But we're actually going to have to screw the central pieces together beforehand to keep them in a block. Then we'll probably need to take them apart to actually cut them, because a jigsaw is not going to go through that depth of timber. And as I say, there's quite a lot of weight in that. So right, I'll take it apart and we'll get it lined up and get on with bolting it together, cutting the pieces out, and see if we can actually make something that looks a bit more like a wheel. I'm also quite excited because I think I had a delivery today, and I think these are the bearings that will attach into the centre of the wheel and also onto the frame at the side. I'm still waiting for the steel shaft to arrive. Hopefully that'll be here tomorrow. So obviously a lot more work to do. So the next time you see this, hopefully it will be somewhat together and we'll be looking at cutting the pieces out. Right, we now have the main constituents of the wheel cut out, and what we have to do, the next stage of the process, is going to be to cut out the quadrant from one of the outside shroud parts of the wheel. Now yesterday I received a delivery of what I hope is the bearings and the bearing flanges and the pillow blocks for this. So if I need to actually know where I need to start the quadrant from at the centre point of the wheel. The flange is going to sit over the centre, so obviously I don't want to cut that part of the wheel out, so I need to know the minimum amount that I can take out as the quadrant and then the maximum. So we've got in here, or we should have, some bearings, and here's one of the flanges, and this will actually be mounted centrally onto the wheel like that. This has an internal bearing and attaches to the shaft, so it'll stop it from the wheel from sliding from side to side. But I need to mark this centrally onto this wheel so that I can make sure that the quadrant has got plenty of room around it, so that we're not removing too much timber. So if I draw around this flange, and I also need the hole positions, because we're going to actually drill all the way through all of the portions of the wheel and actually bolt the whole thing together at the centre point. So I've got those marked now. I've also, while I'm unpacking, I'll just show you the pillow blocks, and these will sit on the frame on either side with the shaft going through them. Again, we get 2 grub screws which will screw down onto the shaft to allow us to clamp the shaft into the bearing, so we don't have to put any sort of cap on the end of it. So they're fairly chunky, very solid pieces of kit, and they'll bolt very nicely onto the top of the frame like that, and that will then have the wheel sitting in the centre. So our first job is to therefore mark out the position of the quadrant. Put those away for the moment, and we're going to look at using something like give it probably 80mm of space, which will take us to about here. We can then go up to the centre point that we marked before, onto the circle and out to the side. So I'll mark that up now, and then we can do some cutting. Okay, so we've got the top part that we want to cut out. We've marked the quadrant that we're going to remove, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut these out carefully, because if the balance is wrong on the wheel, then potentially we could put back one or other of these quadrants to try and rebalance it. The idea being, of course, that all of the weight is at the bottom of the wheel. So this we're determining is the bottom of the wheel, which means we will reduce weight from the top to give an element of balance. I want to actually put it together and try it before I add any additional weight to the bottom, because having felt the weight of the wheel overall, I think we're going to be fairly close to the weight that we want without actually adding any additional weight at present. So I'm going to drill a hole in each corner, and then I'm going to use the jigsaw to cut out these two quadrants on this piece, and then once we've got that, then we can use this as a template to drill all the other pieces. But of course at that time as well, we're going to have to make sure that we align the holes here so that we're central on each of the pieces as they go through. So we're going to drill these holes as well, but not the center core hole yet, so that we can actually line them up correctly as we take the quadrants out of all of the center pieces as well. So I'll get my drill and saw and we'll get on with that. Okay, that's got the two quadrants cut out of the wheel, and we now should find that the weight on the bottom of the wheel will be greater, and hopefully will be enough to provide that difference in balance. Now the only other thing we've got to do is to drill the 4 holes for the central bearing flange so that we can actually locate that onto the unit below, or the circle of timber below, to get that one positioned correctly with relation to the quadrant. So at this point we're going to do the line up as we go through each of the pieces cutting the quadrants out. We need to do the line up, and that will be the final line up for the wheel. So we'll get on with that. So there we have 2 pieces cut the same, so we've got the 2 outsides. Now we need to line up the centres of all the others and then cut out the quadrants as we go, so that we end up with the whole wheel. Now the first issue that I have is I need to decide really which way I'm going to put these, and I think that as I've got these with 2 pieces on them, I'm going to look at how they will fit around. I think that could be awkward, so the quadrant I think will have to go out of the top half of this board, and then this can be at the bottom. It is going to be screwed or bolted through, so it isn't going to be a problem for moving, but I just think if we cut the quadrant out of this small piece, then what we'll end up with is an issue of having very small pieces of timber at the top here. So I'll mark those up then, and we'll centre them first, and once we've centred them then we can mark and cut the quadrants accordingly. So that's the next step. Okay, that's all of the wheel parts cut out, all the quadrants cut out. You can see that this last one we've actually had to do in 3 pieces, and there's going to be a small gap because I didn't quite have the width of timber to do the 95 diameter on the wheel using this timber. So I'm going to use a gap, but the reason that I don't think that's going to be a problem is that I was thinking about the edges on here, and they're quite rough. Now we can sand those down and we can make it as smooth, and we'll actually do that anyway, so all the edges are as smooth as possible. But my thought was that the rope, and particularly the sally, could actually catch on this rough edge. So I've got some thin hardboard here, which I am going to cut down and actually put, I think, inside the wheel, so that the actual rope runs on this, because I can just basically tack that in. It will be removable, so if we need to take the wheel apart, then we can do, but that will just make that smoothness. So these small gaps and small imperfections in the circles that I've cut shouldn't have too much effect on the rope itself. So I'm going to have a tidy up now, and then we'll look at putting the wheel together so we can actually check that all of the cutouts are correct. Right, nothing beats a tidy workplace. So now what we can do is get the various parts of the wheel, and we'll leave that one for the top. So that's the one with all our pre-cut holes in. We'll start off with a bottom, and then we'll go for the two with the small pieces that need putting back in. Let's line those up. And we'll go for the one in 3 pieces. Final full-size piece. And then of course we'll have the final piece that makes up the other shroud. At the top. So there we have the wheel with its suitable cutouts. So now we have to fix this together and then drill the long holes going through. The fixing I'm going to do by actually drilling through in 4 positions and then putting some threaded rod through and then countersinking it and pulling it to, if there's enough depth to countersink. I think there will be, and that will hold the wheel together. And until I've got that together, I don't want to drill this central hole, because the central hole needs to be absolutely spot on right the way through, because that's where the shaft's going to go. Now I was hoping the shaft was going to arrive today, but it hasn't so far, so we may be leaving this the drilling of that hole until tomorrow to actually complete the wheel build, and then it's a case of put the 2 bearings on with the shaft through, bolt those through, and then we can sand down, clean up, and any edges we can remove so it looks as good as we can get it. And of course then cut the hardboard to run around the centre here. So that's the plan. We'll get on with that. So there you have it. The wheel is basically together. I've put these studs in just to hold it in place and allow me to actually tip it up and sort of feel the weight. And I think you'll find that if we tip it up, as you can see, it's a fairly heavy wheel, but the balance is there below, or it should be off balance, sorry, to give the feeling of the bell at the bottom. So now basically a bit of tidying up. I've got to just sand down these parts, sand the edges, and then I can put the strip of hardboard around the middle, which is where the running will be. I will have to drill a garter hole right the way through here into the centre, but I'm not sure of the position yet, so I'm not going to do that. I'm also not going to put the final 2 bolts in here, just in case I have to adjust anything. So there we have it. The wheel is ready, so all I have to do now is build the frame, put in the central bearing hub, and we can see how it looks before it goes into situ. So that's really the end of this section. As I say, I'm going to tidy this up, but I don't think you'll need to be watching me doing lots of sanding. Okay, and I'll see you in part 5 when we make the frame.